Did you know that in Walberswick, it's unlucky to meet a woman before going to sail on a Friday? Or that the terrifying black shuck stalks the Suffolk countryside, with some calling it a hideous beast and others saying actually he's a pretty cool guy and he protects lone women? And have you heard of the witches' stones in Lowestoft? It's said that unless they are burned with fire, they will race down to the seashore at the first strike of midnight to bathe in the water before rushing back to be back in place by the last stroke of 12. Or maybe you've heard the tale of Mother Lumpkin, the river hag of Middleton, who loves to drag children into the river that she inhabits. Suffolk and East Anglia are alive with folklore and mythology, and today we're going to be talking about some of the ladies of lore that come from this little coastal region in England. Hello and welcome to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we take all of the most wonderful women of mythology and folklore and we unpick, unravel and explore their origins, their stories and how they've changed through time to arrive in today's modern world. I'm India and I'm your host and I'm so grateful to have you here with me today. If you're new to the podcast, welcome on in. I really hope you like it here, and if you're returning back, hello again. I appreciate you coming back. If you enjoy the podcast, please do feel free to follow on your favourite podcast platform. And I am very, very pleased to say that the Ladies of Lore Patreon is now live and ready for you to join. And part of this is the Discord server, which is also free to join. All you need to do is register on the Patreon to get the link. You don't have to pay for that. It is absolutely free. I have lots of exciting stuff to come over on the Patreon, and if you are part of it, you will be the very first to know all of the latest Ladies of Lore stuff as I release what's called a weekly scroll every week with the lowdown and sometimes even photos of things like alpacas that I have met or coffees that I have consumed. Speaking of that, it's been a while, hasn't it? I actually realised as soon as I announced the schedule change that I then had a week's holiday away in the Lake District, so I've been very busy recharging in the sunshine, drinking far too much coffee, and watching A Knight's Tale the musical. So apologies for my extended absence, but I am back and I'm recharged and I'm ready to go. So this week I'm trying something new and a little bit different, because today's episode isn't going to focus on just one lady of lore. Instead, we're going to be journeying to the windswept coasts and rural byways of Suffolk and a little bit of East Anglia. And this is a county in eastern England where folklore still whispers through the hedgerows. And it's also where I live, which is why I picked it for the first location-based episode. And I really hope that you all enjoy this foray into something slightly different. And please do tell me what you think, either in the comments where you're listening or over on the Patreon or on the Discord or on Blue Sky. All of the links to everything you need to know will be in the show notes. So let me know what you think, because it's new, isn't it? And I don't know necessarily if you'll like it or not. I really hope you do. And if you do, let me know, because I can do more of these and I'd love to do more of these. It's been really fun to research. Now, if you're ready and you've got yourself a little drink and a little snack, let's take a look at the women, the powerful, mysterious, and sometimes a little bit scary women who have shaped this region's legends for centuries. Let Ladies of Lore on Tour begin. To kick us off on this Ladies of Lore tour of East Anglia, I'm going to take you back to the 12th century and to the little village of Woolpit to tell you a story of a very interesting little girl who was found there. Now, this was a time when England was recovering from the turbulence of the Norman conquest and grappling with a fractured political landscape. And the two principal historical sources for this account are the chronicles of William of Nuba and Ralph of Coggeshall. And these are quite reliable monastic chroniclers, though their accounts reflect this blend of observation, Christian influences, and myth-making that characterised medieval historiography, as we very well know from previous episodes of Ladies of Lore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the story, and we'll do a little bit of a dive into it afterwards once you've got the full picture. In the high summer of a year long faded from memory, when England was torn by wars and kings rose like storms, the reapers of Woolpit went into the fields beneath a copper sky, their sickles flashing in the grain like silverfish. The harvest was good. The air was heavy with the sun, and the pits that ringed the village lay empty, half forgotten. But that morning, something stirred near one of the old traps. A cry. Soft at first, and then two figures stumbled from the thickets. One boy and one girl. Their skin the same green as river reeds, their eyes wide with terror. They wore clothes stitched from no fabric the villagers had ever seen before, and they spoke in words that bent and slithered like smoke. The reapers froze. Children they were, clearly, but not of this world. The sun struck their faces, and they flinched as though it pained them. Some crossed themselves, others whispered of fairies or the devil's brood. But the lord of the manor, a knight named Sir Richard, took them in, perhaps from pity or curiosity, or both. In the manor house they were offered bread, meat, milk, but all of this they refused. They wept, they clung to one another. For days they would not eat. And then one of the kitchen maids brought broad beans. And the children cried out with joy, a sound so strange and musical. And they fell upon the beans, devouring them raw, pod and all. And from that day, they began to live, surviving on broad beans alone. However, the boy, who was the younger of the two, weakened soon after. He took to fever, and then silence. And though baptised by the village priest, he didn't wake from his final sleep. A small grave was dug behind the chapel, and the villagers wept, some from sorrow, some from fear, for who could know what his death might bring upon the village? And you would think that grief would ruin the girl, but instead she grew strong, and with time her green hue faded, leaving only the ghost of a glow beneath her skin. She learned to speak English, her voice still lilting like a flute, and at last she told her tale. She said that her and her brother had come from a place called St. Martin's Land, where the sun never rose and all was bathed in twilight. In that place, everything was green, the trees, the sky, the people. And one day they followed their father's herds into a cave. There they heard a sound like bells or birds, or maybe wind, and they were drawn into a darkness so complete it swallowed them. And when they emerged, they were here. No one could say where this St. Martin's Land might be. Could it be beneath the earth, beyond the veil, or even inside a dream? Scholars whispered theories, priests muttered of purgatory, old wives warned of the fae. But the girl, now called Agnes, lived on. She worked in the manor's kitchens and grew into a woman of strange beauty, and later married a man in King's Lynn. They say she bore children with eyes just a little too wide, who spoke in their sleep of rivers made of light. And sometimes, when the fog rolls thick over the fields near Woolpit, the old ones say you can still hear two small voices calling to each other, one in English and one in a language nobody speaks anymore. And there you have it. That's the story of the lost girl of Woolpit. Kind of creepy in a way, but also I love that she managed to settle down and have a life here and have children and go on to live pretty normally. I wonder though if she ate anything but broad beans. I don't know. Unknown. Unconfirmed. Regardless, interpretations of this very strange tale spun multiple domains from folklore to science fiction, and a folkloric reading might suggest that this is a bit of a garbled memory of children from a different culture or country, and it has actually been theorised that the children were perhaps Flemish immigrants who were displaced or orphaned during this period of war and upheaval, and their green skin could be the result of malnutrition, particularly chlorosis or hypochromic anemia, which causes a greenish pallor. And this medical interpretation is actually supported by the girl's eventual recovery and the loss of this green tint. Linguistic confusion, unfamiliar clothing, and cultural estrangement would naturally follow. Naturally? Did I just say naturally? I don't know. Cultural estrangement would naturally follow from being strangers in a foreign land. But as I'm sure you can imagine, speculative theories were abound as well, and some suggest that a psychological or allegorical origin for the tale, where the story represents spiritual transformation, that of the journey from an alien, dark world to baptism, assimilation and enlightenment. And that would certainly track with what we've learned already on earlier episodes of the podcast, where we've seen many tales be Christianised and moralised. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, the tale has attracted even more attention, this time from ufologists? Are there two O's in that word? Ufologists and paranormal enthusiasts. And they speculate that the children were actually extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings, citing their green skin, otherworldly speech and mysterious origin as potential evidence. And if you know anything about Suffolk, we do have some UFO stuff here. There's a whole forest, Rendlesham Forest, where there is a UFO trail. And look that one up. I'll pop some links in the show notes so you can have a look. But it's definitely an interesting theory. And modern media and literature have drawn on these green children in various ways. In literature, for example, Herbert Reed's 1934 novel The Green Child provides a bit of an existential and surreal reinterpretation of the tale, blending political allegory with fantastical elements. And this story has also appeared in children's books, in speculative fiction, in folk horror narratives. It's inspired episodes on TV documentaries, such as those dealing with ancient mysteries and unexplained phenomena. In music and theatre and art, the image of green children appearing from an unknown world continues to resonate as a metaphor for otherness, for exile and transformation. And this story's themes of alienation, of integration, and the permeability of the boundaries between worlds continue to inspire reinterpretations in modern science fiction, notably in novels and short stories involving interdimensional travel or post-apocalyptic isolation. And do you know what's really cute? In England, when you go into a new village, there's sort of a little sign for the village. Everywhere has one. And Woolpit has two little green children on it, and it's very adorable. And I would encourage you to look that up because it's very cute. But ultimately, the lost girl of Woolpit stands at the intersection of history and legend. She's a bit of a haunting figure, really, and her origins remain elusive. Whether she's a reflection of medieval misunderstandings of cultural difference, a distorted memory of real historical events, or a mythic representation of a spiritual awakening, her story continues to evoke curiosity and wonder in every generation. So what do you think? Where do you think this little green girl came from? Let me know. Okay, now we are going to fast forward a little bit to the 16th and 17th centuries, where Suffolk saw some of the worst witch trials in England, especially during the frenzy of Matthew Hopkins, the self-appointed Witchfinder General. I'm so excited to talk to you about this one. I actually went to Salem at the end of last year, which, as we all know, is the witch capital of the world, and it sparked a bit of a hyperfixation in me, so it's really cool to be able to sit down today and talk to you about witches, and about witches who live right where I live. It's pretty cool. So the story of Suffolk witches and the cunning women is very deeply woven into the fabric of English folklore, a narrative steeped in fear, fascination and superstition. Suffolk was one of the central theatres of the English witch trials, particularly during the mid-17th century, and it was here that witch hysteria reached one of its most intense peaks, not only through legal proceedings, but in the realm of oral tradition, rural lore and mythic imagination. In the popular imagination of early modern Suffolk, witches were not merely criminal deviants to be prosecuted. They were actually figures of dark reverence and fear, woven into everyday life and local belief. These women were often older, poor or socially marginal, and they were believed to wield very harmful magic through pacts with the devil, carrying out evil deeds, and communication with familiar spirits. And these were small animals or imps said to aid in their dark work. And these beliefs were sustained not merely by religious doctrine, but by a folkloric worldview in which misfortune, so things like spoiled milk, sick livestock, and sudden illness, could always be traced back to a supernatural interference, and villagers often identified witches by intuition or by reputation far long before any legal processes began. And this is something that we've seen before on several different episodes. Humans have always, since as far as we know, sought out ways to explain the unexplainable, a way to make sense of tragedy or things that we don't understand. And often these explanations come in the form of some kind of evil figure or spirit. And let's face it, a lot of the time, they're women. And running parallel to this fear of witches was the role of the cunning folk, or wise women and men. And these were real folk healers. They were herbalists and spiritual mediators who used charms, potions and prayers to treat ailments or undo curses. And while they weren't officially sanctioned by the church, they were often tolerated or even sought after. Yet the boundary between a cunning woman and a witch was dangerously thin. If a remedy failed, or if fortunes reversed, the healer could suddenly be recast as a bringer of harm. And this ambiguity made cunning women both respected and vulnerable. And many accused witches were originally local healers, whose perceived powers were turned against them in times of panic. And one of the darkest chapters in Suffolk's witch lore came during the 1640s, when the infamous Matthew Hopkins, like I said earlier, the self-styled witch-finder general, swept through East Anglia during the English Civil War. His campaign was supported by Puritan fervour and social instability, and it led to the trials and executions of dozens of alleged witches. Suffolk, along with Essex and Norfolk, saw some of the highest numbers of executions, and trials were often based on spectral evidence, confessions extracted under duress, and the supposed discovery of witches' marks or familiars. Folklore and legal paranoia fed on each other. Hopkins claimed to find entire covens of witches and networks of witches. Villagers pointed fingers at neighbours, and ancient superstitions about shape-shifting, flying or cursing were taken as real legal evidence. You could pretty much say anything and you'd be believed. There is another Monty Python scene here that I could quote, but I will refrain. But you can look that up on YouTube about Monty Python. Just put in YouTube, Monty Python witches. And that is pretty accurate. You could literally say anything and they would just say, okay, yeah, sounds like a witch. And I'm going to tell you now the story of two women from Suffolk, probably the most infamous figures in the Suffolk witch trials, Amy Denny of Reydon and Rose Cullender, also of Reydon. Amy Denny was an elderly woman, poor and reputed to be quarrelsome, traits commonly linked to witchcraft accusations. She was accused of causing illness through sorcery and of having imps or familiars in the form of small animals. She was the classic crazy cat lady. And it was Samuel Pacey, a wealthy fish merchant and one of Lowestoft's most influential figures, who sought out and obtained warrants from Magistrate Sir Edmund Bacon for her arrest. And why ever did he do that, I hear you ask? Well, Samuel's accusations against Amy Denny began when she attempted to buy herrings from him. For reasons unknown, he refused to sell any to her, and after being turned away a second time, Amy returned once more. But she was again refused. But this time, as she left, she mumbled something under her breath. And around the same time, Samuel's daughter Deborah, aged 7, who had been unwell but recovering, suddenly suffered violent fits and stomach pains. She cried out at Amy, leading Samuel to suspect her of witchcraft. 2 weeks later, another of his daughters, 11-year-old Elizabeth, was similarly stricken. Accusations came from other townspeople, Edmund Durrant, for example, refused to sell herrings to Rose Cullender, only for his daughter Anne to fall ill with the same stomach pains. Witnesses repeatedly described symptoms like the pricking of pins, and a grand jury ultimately decided that both Amy and Rose should stand trial. They were taken to Bury Jail and were charged with bewitching 7 children from a few months old to 18 years old, and one had apparently died due to the witchcraft. And they were also accused of bewitching 4 horses. In total, they had 14 charges against them, and they pleaded not guilty to them all. It will probably come as no shock to you to learn that they were not allowed any legal defence, nor were they allowed to testify. They were found guilty within 30 minutes on all counts except that of the horses. After the verdict was given, they were permitted to speak, but we'll never know what they said because it wasn't recorded. Records simply state that they said nothing material to anything that was proved against them. Amy and Rose were hanged on Monday, March the 17th, 1662, likely at Fingo Hill or on Shirehouse Heath outside the north gate of Bury St Edmunds. To this day, their final resting place remains unknown. And do you want to know the best bit, or the worst bit? Just 2 years later, Samuel Pacey, that grotsky little biatch himself, was actually accused of holding illegal religious meetings and stood trial in Bury St Edmunds too. But the outcome of that is not known. We can all hope that he got what he deserved, but you didn't hear me say that. And very interestingly, his brother, Nicholas Pacey, immigrated to Salem, Massachusetts in 1638, where he was granted some land. So the Pacey family actually did have links to the infamous Salem witch trials, but that's not actually where the links to Salem end, because the trial of Amy and Rose actually set a legal precedent that had a massive influence over the Salem witch trials in 1692, with the materials published during the trial, which are called the Trial of Witches, being consulted very heavily in Salem to help determine what evidence was admissible. So really, this case from little old Suffolk had a massive influence and almost set the standard of witch trialing both in England and in... Another well-known story involves Elizabeth Clark from the village of Manningtree, which is technically in Essex, but her trial influenced nearby Suffolk communities. Her body was reportedly marked with witches' teats from which imps suckled. And Clark became one of the earliest victims of Matthew Hopkins, whose reign of terror spread swiftly through Suffolk and into the neighbouring counties of Essex. Her confession was very likely extracted under duress, and she named other witches in this confession, setting off a chain of arrests across the region. And then there's another tale from Polstead, where a woman was suspected of cursing a farmer's pigs. She was seen muttering by their pen one day, and the next morning, all the pigs were dead. The villagers believed that she had a familiar spirit that entered the animals and destroyed them from within. And when she was finally confronted, she supposedly screamed and fled in the woods, never to be seen again. And also there's the Chidiston witch, and this legend tells of an unnamed, cunning woman who lived on the edge of a village. According to the local stories, she could heal sick cattle and remove curses. But if offended, she could strike a man blind or sour the milk in his churn. Her cottage was said to have charms hanging above every doorway, and travellers were warned not to speak ill of her while passing by. Even decades after her death, people avoided her grave, believing that disturbing her rest would bring misfortune. And there's also some wild stories of anti-witch measures. In Saxmundham, for instance, which is very close to me, a blacksmith once claimed to have made dozens of witch bottles, and these were glass containers filled with urine, hair and iron nails buried beneath thresholds to trap malevolent spirits. I wonder if they worked. I actually know a few people who live in Saxmundham, so I will ask them, do you know if there's a bottle of wee under the threshold of your house? And does it work? Does it stop witches and malevolent spirits coming in? Another tradition in Debenham involved burning the heart of a witch's familiar to reverse a curse, with one tale claiming that the heart should actually be placed in a barn, pierced with pins and burned in a ritual that made everyone afflicted by the witch recover. So there are a few stories that reveal how real fears about illnesses, misfortune and social disorder were interpreted through a supernatural lens. Suffolk's landscape is dotted with the echoes of these tales, in field names like Witch's Hollow, in old cottages with protective marks carved into the doorframes, and in the regional folklore still retold at heritage festivals and ghost walks. The witches of Suffolk, both feared and fabled, continue to animate the cultural memory of the region, standing as shadows of a time when magic, mystery and the mundane were inseparably entwined. From a mythological standpoint, the Suffolk witches represent more than historical victims. They embody the tension between communal fear and ancestral wisdom, between feminine power and patriarchal control, and between the visible and invisible worlds. The narratives that emerged from Suffolk's witch trials have entered into the broader English mythos, giving rise to eerie ballads, ghost stories, and fictional reinterpretations. Modern writers and folklorists have drawn from Suffolk's deep reservoir of witch lore to explore themes of resistance, marginalisation, and spiritual mystery. In many ways, the witch has evolved from a figure of terror into one of ambiguous empowerment, a symbol not only of ancient fear but of enduring folklore, reclaimed and reimagined. And you can read a little bit more about the Suffolk witch trials in the links in the episode notes, but I will also be doing a full episode about witches, about the Salem witch trials in general, over on Heroines of History on Patreon in the future, so keep your eyes out for that. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about someone who has been requested a few times on the podcast. Her influence spanned across East Anglia, and she is one of the most fascinating female figures, very deeply rooted in both folklore and history. Boudicca. Mist drapes the flatlands of East Anglia like a burial shroud. In the damp silence of the fens, a pyre smoulders atop a low rise near the river valleys that will one day cradle Norwich. A woman stands motionless, tall and flame-haired, her cloak billowing into the breeze like a tattered banner. Her daughters clutch at her sides, their faces half hidden in wool and grief. Around them, elders of the Iceni tribe lower their heads. The fire crackles softly, devouring the body of Prasudicus, the king. His death, once thought to pass power peacefully into Roman-friendly hands, instead tears the veil from an empire's pretense. Days pass. Roman riders arrive at Venta Icenorum, their formation slicing through the tribal capital like a blade. They carry no condolences, only scrolls, imperial decrees that revoke promises, seize land and disinherit Boudicca's bloodline. They stride into her hall with their heads high but eyes sharp and scornful. There is no debate. The will of the king is dismissed, and the queen is dragged into the dirt. Her daughters scream as Roman fists and boots fall upon them. No voice rises, only breath stolen, dignity ripped away under the watchful gaze of the eagle standards. Boudicca does not speak, but her silence grows louder with each day. Beneath the canopies of Thetford Forest, she gathers her people. Fires burn low in sacred groves where druids stir the spirits of the land. Warriors emerge from the thickets, bearing axes, spears, and old scores. They come from the edges of the Brecklands, from the valleys of the Wensum and Yare. At dusk, she stands before them, her body painted in swirling woad, bronze sword raised high. The wind carries no chant, no oration, only the rustle of leaves and the beat of war drums felt deep in the chest. They strike first at Camalodunum, Roman Colchester, where temples to Claudius gleam in foreign stone. The sky turns black with smoke as the Iceni torch the colony. Statues crack and fall and villas shudder under the fury of the tribes. Roman citizens flee, But there is no mercy in the eyes of those who had none shown to them. From there, they march through the wildlands, crossing rivers swollen with spring rains, and descend on Londinium. The Roman governor, Suetonius, abandons it. The city burns. Verulamium falls next. Through it all, Boudicca rides at the front, her chariot wheels cutting deep ruts into the earth. Her daughters ride beside her, eyes steel hard. They say she wears a necklace of Roman coins taken from the dead. They say the animals in the fields turn and follow her with reverence. The land itself seems to rise behind her in rebellion. But in the Midlands, the fury meets the machine. Suetonius rallies the Roman legions and selects his ground well, narrow, wooded and fortified. The Britons, vast in number but scattered in force, pour into the trap. The Roman wall of shields holds. The slaughter is merciless. Thousands fall. Among the dying, the silent queen vanishes. Some say she drank poison. Some say the forest took her back. In the stillness that follows, the land does not forget. The smoke clears, but her name lingers in the rivers, in the trees, and in the wind that moans across the fens. Boudicca, the flame of East Anglia, burns still, not in triumph, but in defiance. And there's a bit of a dramatised story of Boudicca. Historically, her revolt took place around 60 to 61 CE, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero. Tacitus and Cassius Dio, Roman historians, recorded her story with a mixture of awe and disdain. They provided the only written sources that we have, though filtered through Roman eyes. Her uprising is a rare glimpse into the resistance against Roman imperialism in Britain, a moment where fractured tribes found unity, if only briefly. The Romans ultimately reasserted control, but the rebellion revealed the fragility of empire and planted seeds of British identity far long before such a concept existed. Yet what is truly enduring about Boudicca is not the battle counts or strategy, it's how she passed into something more: folklore. And that's why we are talking about her today. She's very much a liminal figure. She's half history, half goddess. And over the centuries, her story was reshaped by druids and rebels and poets and monarchs alike. In the Elizabethan era, she was reinvented as a paragon of Protestant defiance. In the Victorian age, she became an icon of empire and nationalism, ironically used to bolster the very kind of conquest that she once opposed. And yet, beneath these layers, older roots persist of the Earth Mother Queen, the sovereign spirit of Albion, who rises when the land is desecrated. All of the history and the various interpretations of Boudicca I am going to pick up and cover, as I say, in her own episode on Heroines of History, but let's lock in on the folklore and myth side of things for now. In local mythology, especially in East Anglia and parts of London, Boudicca is not just remembered, she haunts. Ancient trees are said to bow in her memory. Stones mark her passage. Roads are named for her chariots, and old wives still tell their tales of the warrior queen who will return in Britain's darkest hour. She is in many, many ways similar to King Arthur. She's a figure straddling myth and memory, with one foot in the world of the living and the other in the land of the spirits. And that is kind of how myth works. It takes all of these broken bones of history and it sort of weaves flesh around them, breathing life into what mere facts cannot hold. Boudicca, the burning queen, the chariot of vengeance, the whisper in the wild woods, she lives not because she ruled, but because she refuses to be forgotten. In East Anglia, Boudicca is embedded within broader folkloric systems that often blend Christian and pre-Christian motifs. And there's a book called Pilgrimage in Medieval East Anglia of 2017, and in this book it is noted that legends of East Anglian saints often inherited themes of martyrdom, native resistance and feminine sanctity, and these themes echo Boudicca's narrative to the T, and were likely actually shaped in parallel, if not directly influenced, by her very mythos. The landscape of shrines and pilgrimages in the region was marked by semi-legendary stories that paralleled her tale, particularly that of a righteous woman standing against an invading force, linking mythic nationalism with religious devotion. Further, the artistic and spiritual legacy of Boudicca appears in East Anglian medieval art and iconography, often disguised in Christian form. Simon Ashley and Andy Marsden in 2014, in their book Landscapes and Artefacts, highlight how Boudicca's image might have actually been sublimated into representations of female saints and goddesses in local church carvings and inscriptions. There was a bit of a conflation of Boudicca with other figures like St Audrey in Ely. So Ely has a bit of folklore that creates this hybrid mythology in which sacred femininity and national identity intersect, and that is very much influenced by Boudicca, and her representation is sometimes in the form of other figures. And there are also localised ghost stories and legends in Suffolk that invoke Boudicca. In Paranormal Suffolk, Reeve records tales of spectral chariots seen racing through Thetford Forest, and this has actually been interpreted as Boudicca's restless spirit guarding her ancestral lands. Similarly, nearby mounds are said to rumble with the sound of hooves and war cries, typically surfacing in oral tradition around seasonal festivals or significant local anniversaries. And as I said earlier, the etymology and persistence of place names in Suffolk also attest to her mythic resonance. According to The Origins of Suffolk by Warner, villages like Boudicca's Way and relic battlefields labelled with Iceni-associated terms suggest a very long-standing oral and cultural memory embedded in local identity, and these naming conventions serve as evidence of a bit of a sacred geography. In literary terms, Boudicca is portrayed in early modern poetry and Elizabethan drama as a noble heroine with divine sanction. And it's been argued that the reimagining of Boudicca during the reign of Elizabeth I in particular linked East Anglia to the imperial imagination, establishing her both as a regional and national mythic figure. So it's clear that Boudicca's influence on folklore and mythology in Suffolk and East Anglia is enduring. It's deeply woven into the regional cultural identity and landscape narratives. As the warrior queen of the Iceni tribe, Boudicca is not just a historical figure, but she's a mythic archetype in East Anglian consciousness, transcending history into legend, symbolising native resistance, feminine power, and territorial belonging. And there's a little bit about Boudicca. I have focused, like I said, more on storytelling and folklore today and how she's influenced local folklore and mythology, but this is another figure that I will absolutely be putting out a full episode of Heroines of History on in time, so I'll let you guys know when that one is available to hear over on the Patreon. And I'm also just so excited to be able to talk about Boudicca because a little bit of a background on me. When I was little, I used to love going to the Ipswich Museum, which is currently closed for renovations. I'm very excited for it to reopen, but I used to go to Ipswich Museum as much as I possibly could. And I remember my mum taking me for the first time. And one of the things in Ipswich Museum was a life-size figure of Boudicca. And I remember looking at it and being so terrified because she's sort of growling almost in this sculpture of her, and not only was I scared of her, I was absolutely fascinated by her. I was fascinated by this woman, and it just blew my little socks off to think that she lived where I lived. And I think it's incredible that places like that and things like that, something as simple as me being probably like 6 or 7 years old, seeing a life-sized recreation of Boudicca, sparked this lifelong love of history, folklore and mythology, and that's why I'm here today. So that is a little bit of backstory that you probably didn't need, but if you do Google it, I'm pretty sure you can see Just Google Ipswich Museum Boudicca and you'll see the statue that myself and probably many other children over the years were terrified of, but also fascinated with. And finally, on the Ladies of Law tour of Suffolk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our fairies here in Suffolk. Fairy folklore in Suffolk and East Anglia is rich, distinctive, and often a bit underestimated. Unlike the more commonly known Celtic fairy traditions of Ireland or Scotland, the East Anglian fairy belief system has a uniquely earthy, domestic, and sometimes a bit unsettling character. We're earthy here in Suffolk. We are earthy. And these traditions reflect this region's rurality, the pre-Christian belief systems, and the resilience of oral history in a landscape long associated with magic and marginality. A central figure in Suffolk folklore is the Haita sprite, a fairy-like being found particularly in northeast Suffolk. These entities are typically described as sandy-haired, green-eyed and mischievous, not unlike the Fairies of Suffolk mentioned by Rabuzi in 1984, who distinguishes them from the more ethereal, courtly fairies. They are local, they are elemental, and deeply tied to the terrain of marshes, heaths and ancient tracks. Their behaviour is often ambiguous. They can lead children astray into the woods, but equally, if they feel like it, they can also help farmers or warn of danger. And this echoes older pagan spirits of place or genius loci, and that refers to spirits or deities associated with a particular place in Roman religion and mythology. In the context of fairy folklore, it describes supernatural beings that are deeply connected to and protective of the specific locations. And there's a book. I'm mentioning a lot of books today, but I've done a lot of research. As you know, I like to get lost in the source. So in Francis Young's Suffolk Fairy Lore book of 2021, he challenges this prevailing myth that East Anglia was a folklore poor region. I am doing air quotation marks when I say folklore poor, because whoever said that was obviously wrong, as we now know, because I've just told you a boatload of folklore and mythology from this area. Anyway, Francis Young offers a very comprehensive catalogue of fairy sightings, of customs and oral traditions that link directly to both Anglo-Saxon survivals and Christian reinterpretations. For instance, stories of children playing with fairies in the fields, like there is one well-known legend from Wickham, which often involves children being pixie-led, and they go away for days on end, and then when they return, they're confused or they have a gift from another world. And Young's work reveals just how deeply embedded these type of stories are in local consciousness, and they linger on even now in the 21st century. And it's definitely a book I would like to read more of. I feel like it makes it even more special, doesn't it, when you're reading about the place that you've lived for your whole life. And there's another study that I read of witchcraft and folk belief by someone called Padraig Lawler. And in his study, he shows how fairies, imps, and domestic spirits like the hob, and the hob, H-O-B, is a type of household spirit or fairy in English folklore, and usually they're benevolent but a little bit mischievous, and they're known for actually helping with domestic tasks and farm work. But anyway, these hobs were not relegated to just children's tales, but they were actually seen as genuine active forces in rural life. And they were used to explain illnesses, missing objects, or unaccountable good fortune. And this continuity was particularly resilient in parts of Suffolk where many households retained charms or protections like horseshoes and hagstones well into the modern period, and you still find them now. And while fairies changed Suffolk, the environmental character of Suffolk shaped them back in return. And they've been described as roughened by the sand, infusing them with a rugged agricultural feel. And that's very different from the courtly fairies of other tales. And many were associated with trees, wells and burial grounds. A common motif is the warning not to disturb fairy rings or to respect certain trees marked with rag offerings. And these behaviours are mirrored in archaeological sites like Sutton Hoo, which, while not directly tied to fairy tales, suggests long-standing reverence for sacred ground. And if you ever find yourself in Suffolk, I would really recommend a trip to Sutton Hoo. It is a wonderful historical place. I digress. There's also several fairy-related place names in East Anglia that still survive today, such as Fairy Hill in Eye or the Pixie Steps near Aldborough. And I might actually go and try and find the Pixie Steps this weekend because I'm very close to them, so I might take a little picture and put that on my blue sky. So keep an eye out for that. But such locations reinforce how fairy traditions are very much geographically encoded. And fairies were often linked to morality, punishing, greed, rewarding, kindness, and ensuring that humans maintained boundaries between their world and the unseen. Interestingly, the intersection of fairy belief with religion and superstition is especially vivid in East Anglia. In Paranormal Suffolk, Clive Reeve recounts a tale of a young girl who vanished for a week after following a bright lady into a hillock. Later, this was believed to be a fairy mound, and when she returned, she was silent for days and she never spoke of what she had seen. And these type of stories blend fairy tradition with ghost lore, and in some versions, even Christian themes of redemption or warning. And finally, in Illustrated Tales of Suffolk of 2021, several fairy legends are retold with historical context. It's really interesting to read it alongside this historical context. And one tale recounts a fairy woman seen washing clothes at a stream in Kersey, believed to be a sign of impending death in the village. And another story describes a bogey-like creature in the East Burgall area that stole shoes and danced under the moonlight, again merging fairy lore with what I would call local eccentricity. So it's pretty clear that fairy folklore in Suffolk and East Anglia shows a rich, diverse, but also very localised spiritual landscape. These traditions are not rooted in the glamour of the fairy court that you might read about these days, but more in the soil, shaped by the region's history, the ecology, and lingering sense of otherworldliness. Very much far from being marginal, the fairies of East Anglia remain potent reminders of the region's deep folkloric soul. So, what do these women of Suffolk folklore tell us? Well, that power wears many faces. That being a woman, healer, ghost, outcast, guide was once enough to make you a legend, but also enough to get you killed. And maybe, just maybe, these stories endure because they're still true. In spirit, if not in fact. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Ladies of Lore. I know it's been a bit of a different one, but if you enjoyed it, please do let me know, and let me know if this location-based episodes are something that you would like to hear more of. It's been really cool to focus on a specific place and find out all about it, and even more so because it's the place I live. So tell me a special place that you would like me to focus on. Maybe it's somewhere you live or you've visited or that means something to you and to your families. Just to clarify, this isn't me asking for your address. This is definitely not me asking for your address. And if you want more Ladies of Lore and to listen to the exclusive Heroines of History series along with the book club and lots more cool fun stuff, please consider signing up to the Patreon. There is so much I have, so much content, so much stuff in my brain that is already there, and it's absolutely free for you to enjoy, and so much more that I have to come. I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.